For this video, I'm going to do an overview of the career of Steve Ditko, the comic book writer and artist, who was born in 1927. His career began in 1953, which is when his first published comics started to appear. And he co-created Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and the Creeper and many other characters. But where to begin? Because he had a very long career from 1953 to when he passed away in 2018. So in this video, I'm going to try to go through my Steve Ditko comics and give a deep dive on my recommendations of what comics to buy, because many of these are reprints. Some of them have been reprinted later, and some haven't. Some are only available in the original issues. So I'll give my advice, and generally I think the Ditko's career is best understood by decades. So in the 1950s, you had generally horror-type comics for Charlton Comics and Marvel Comics. And then in the 1960s, you had mostly superhero comics, as well as, for Marvel, also in the late 60s for DC. And he started doing stuff for Warren in 1966, and we'll talk about that. And then you get to his creator-owned stuff that started in the late 60s. Then stuff in the 1970s, he was still doing creator-owned stuff as well as for other companies. And then in 1978, he returned to Marvel, and his first published work for Marvel appeared in 1979 with Machine Man. And then in the 1980s, he continued to work for Marvel off and on, but he also worked for other publishers and continued to do creator-owned stuff. I also skipped here his Charlton Ghost comics. I have a whole long box of those. We'll talk about those. And then the late 1980s, he did Speedball at Marvel, and then into the 1990s did stuff for various other publishers and as well as Marvel. And then into the 2000s, he had his own creator-owned stuff again. Basically, from 1999 on, it was all creator-owned stuff from Steve Ditko. So it's going to be a long video, but that's if you wanted to know the arc of his career, that's it. The 50s is horror, 60s, superheroes mainly. 70s, creator-owned stuff as well as superheroes. 80s, he did what Michael Oshunker, who has written for Tomorrow's magazines, has called the parallel track, where he was doing stuff for the majors on a sort of assembly line, doing mostly just the penciling for Marvel and DC, as well as doing his own creator-owned stuff like Static in the 1980s. And then he kept doing that in the 90s, and then in the 2000s, he focused on his creator-owned stuff. So that's the arc of his career. We'll take a deep dive into each decade in the rest of this video. So we'll start at the beginning here, and Steve Ditko's career started in 1953, which is when his first published credited comics first appeared. And most of his Charlton 1950s stuff has been reprinted in these books from Fantagraphics Books. There were 6 of them. I'm missing actually volume 5, but this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were edited by Blake Bell. And when I was growing up, in fact, let's show some what it was like for me. Before he had everything in nice hardcover books. When I was growing up, Charlton was, as a little kid, I was more into superheroes. I wasn't into horror fantasy until I became like a teenager. Around the time I was 13, then I started taking more of an interest in Charlton. Unfortunately, by that time, Charlton was all reprints. But the good thing was, about the reprints was they occasionally would reprint old 1950s Ditko stories. So this was the type of thing where I would encounter them. Whereas this is all Ditko art. And there's, it would say reprinted material, copyright 1957, 1958, right there at the bottom. You know, so you would get some classic Ditko. And to me, this Ditko art was so early that it looked really strange to me. You know, it looked even earlier than the Marvel art I was used to seeing from his 1950s stuff. So we'll jump to the next one here. So this issue of Monster Hunters, you know, it's like they even had a little logo, it looks like, because it's the same logo, all Ditko art. The Mysterious Traveler reprints of this one. And this one is all Ditko art inside. This one has Dr. Haunt, who was the host of This Magazine is Haunted. And this is his introduction. Sort of like the Whistler. You have seen me. You mistook me for a furtive blob of darkness, strangely darker than the other shadows, and for a split second you found yourself staring puzzledly. But then the form quickly faded and you forgot. You have heard me, too. You mistook my dry voice for the thin scratching of dead leaves across your window pane, or my laugh for the long drawn-out wail of a train in the distance. But now there shall be no mistake. Now you shall hear Dr. Haunt clearly as I tell my haunting tales. And I can read your minds. At this moment you are wondering what my face looks like. This you shall never know. But since we dwell on the subject, let me tell you the tale of the Faceless Ones. So, you know, this is from 1981, although I bought this later. You know, I was getting into old-time radio at that time, becoming a fan of old-time radio through The Shadow and shows like Suspense, and years later, The Whistler and The Strange Dr. Weird. You know, I would have to think Dr. Haunt would have been inspired by those characters. And, of course, The Mysterious Traveler had his own radio show back then, too. So this really appealed to me. Now these ones here are all ones I bought at the time. So I finally started buying Charlton Comics in late 1983, which is when these ones came out. I think this one was one of the first ones I got. This is Haunted number 71. Now this is a 1970s Ditko cover, but this is a 1950s story. It's very, very Ditko-y, you know, about this painting, which is a doorway into another dimension. You know, I love this stuff, and I was like, wow, I wish I was had been buying this before. And we'll go to this one here. Now this one, I'll be able to show an example of how these Charlton reprints were actually edited. That's the bad thing. So even though they didn't have the comics code on the covers, they did edit it so that there was not so much blood. I mean, originally, the belief is that they edited, back in the 50s, they edited that final panel. So the belief is that actual panel was drawn by another artist, because maybe Ditko's reveal in the last panel wasn't horrific looking enough. But you can see there, that panel there is actually reprinted. The story is reprinted in here. And I'll show you the difference between the Charlton 1980s reprint and how it originally appeared. Like I said, this is a great book to get. The reproduction is really awesome. By the way, Stretching Things is considered like his first story. It wasn't the first story of his to be printed, but it's sort of, you know, by fans and so on, is considered Ditko's debut. But somewhere in here there is that, what was in Sam Dora's box. And the Thing was the magazine that really, the collectors, back in the 1980s when I would read the Overstreet Price Guide, you know, I would think, wow, I'd love to be able to read an issue of The Thing, because it was, you know, it seemed really exciting. You know, it seemed collectors were interested in it. And so this 1950s period of Ditko, for some people, this is their favorite period. These are, you know, classic covers which have been reused. Here's what was in Sam Dora's box. So that's that story we just saw. But we'll look at the ending here, and we'll compare it to the Charlton reprint. So they've removed a little bit of the blood here. You can see some blood dripping down in the original, but here they've removed some of that. And even the little pool of blood that's dripping out, they've darkened that up to make it less horrific. So at the time, I thought I was reading the unedited reprints. It turns out these are edited. On the other hand, though, I'm not going to get rid of these because I have such fond memories of reading these stories. There's one here, Deep in the Mountains was the name of it, from the 50s. And these would have a combination of, I loved that little Steve Ditko signature, and just the way it was drawn. It was very charming looking. It was very simple looking with the little kids. This is a combination of, like, this is a 70s Ditko cover, and then there's like 1970s you know, artwork in here. So that's a mixture of actually, this is some from the late 60s too, a different artist. So these reprints are a bit of a hodgepodge. Like, this has some 2 1950s Ditko stories in it, but it also has you know, 1970s stuff. So you don't have to worry about that. If you're just starting out and you want to try 1950s Ditko, you don't have to worry about these 1980s reprints, which are a bit of a hodgepodge. All you have to do is go to these Fantagraphics hardcover books. There's 6 of them. Just buy all of them, and you'll have all of Ditko's 1950s public domain work anyway. So it's basically all of his non-Marvel work that he did at that time. And so that one was called Strange Suspense. They're named after some of the titles that he worked on. This is called, volume 2 is called Unexplored Worlds. Now they arranged them in order of job number. So there will be a little tiny, let's see if we can find a better one here. It's easier to read. Well, they're all kind of like that. But here's one. Like, this story here was later reprinted by Charlton in the 1970s. You'll see how it says S1509. So that's how they decided to arrange the stories in here. So now we're at S1553 and so on. You know, that's regardless of when they were printed. So they're printing them in the order of job production order, rather than publication order. Which, you know, is an interesting way to doing it, because you can see the evolution of his artwork. There is one drawback to one of these books, is when there was a page that went missing. Now, the one problem with the putting in job numbers is that there's a cover that I believe goes with this story, but I think, or no, and actually I think with this one as well, I think they appear in the previous book, because the first story on the job number was in, you know, used in one of these ones. Let's see if I can find it real quick. I might not. It might be too hard to just find a random cover out of here. You know, anyways, so trust me, one of these things, oh, there's that cover to that one story. Oh, here it is right here too. So there's the reprint of that issue. All right. So this is Impossible Tales. This is volume 4. Then there was one called Dripping with blood or dripping in blood or something like that. That was the volume 5. I don't have that one. And then this is the most recently published one, volume 6. And this was published in, let's see if we can find the date in here. Oh, they have this really hard to read thing that looks like, see if we can read the date on there. 2016. So this is the most recent volume, which is a while ago. So hopefully there'll be more, because there is more to print. Let's see when this one stops. This one stops at 1959, basically. So you get all the 1950s, but not the 1960s. As for originals, you know, if you wanted, you could always get the originals. Like I say, I would just get the hardcovers. They're basically scanned, it looks like, from and cleaned up a little bit from the original books, or from the original comics. Here's an Out of This World. This is one from 1959. Unfortunately, this is one of the oldest ones I have. Unfortunately, this one has no Ditko in it. Now, this is the oldest Charlton comic I have with Ditko work in it. This is an issue of Space Adventures. You can see the logo has been cut off. This one's from 1959. And it has a Ditko story in it with his great artwork, his great lighting. Now, this is, you know, Ditko was working at the same time at Marvel during this point, also working on fantasy and science fiction tales. And Charlton was doing a lot of prizes and things like that at that time. And so I think this is reprinted in one of those books that we just looked at. So a lot of Ditko. I think he did all the stories except one in here. The story here is not drawn by Ditko. But then there's another Ditko story here at the back. So all but one story drawn by Ditko in this issue, 1959. Now he gradually slowed down on his output for Charlton as his workload for Marvel picked up. But he still continued to work for Charlton. During the time that he was doing Spider-Man, even we'll look at that in a little bit. But this is right before Spider-Man. I got a few issues here of Mysteries of Unexplored Worlds. I don't think this one has any Ditko in it, but this one and this one do. This is from March 1961. And it has a sort of whimsical little look to it. You know, but even though Charlton paid very poorly, you know, he was still putting a lot of detail in. This little thing with the gnome. It always reminds me of like a ACG, you know, American Comics Group. Had little stories like that. Little fantasy, cutesy type stories. But he only had the one story in that issue. And here's issue number 24 from... So this is the next issue, May 1961. And again, just has one Ditko story in this issue. This has a funny title. She's weird. But not drawn by Ditko. And some of the non-Ditko, there's a statement of ownership. I don't think they had gave circulation counts yet, though. Some of the artwork that's non-Ditko at this point in Charlton Comics is kind of drab looking. I don't really care for it. But Ditko has his unique style. It really stands out. So I think another attraction for Ditko, apart from Charlton not really, asking for editorial changes and things like that was not much anyway. Was that he was, their top artist. His work really stands out compared to others. This is just at the back of the story, but it's still the cover featured story. And this other one, which I thought a minute ago didn't have any Ditko, it turns out it does have one Ditko story at the very back. This one is issue number 26 from September 1961. So this is just a year before Amazing Fantasy number 15 comes out. And he has one little story at the back. About a sick child. And there's the rest of the story. Not much of the way of horror. It's sort of a, mysteries of unexplored worlds. By this time, the comics code had been added, and it says still 10 cents, but when it says still 10 cents, that means it's almost going to be 12 cents. But yeah, by this point, it was less horror and more just kind of mystery and, just sort of like Twilight Zone-ish type thing. Nothing really to scare people. So after that, I'm going to jump ahead to show he had a couple different periods at Charlton, because he worked at Charlton from the early 1950s, as we saw, to basically like 1954 to 1985. He worked at Charlton with big gaps in between. And, based on Charlton being out of business or, not publishing new stories, whenever they published new stories, he would work for him. But this one, in the mid-60s, before they really got into the ghost comics stuff, which they really got into by 1966, and then generally even more so in the 1970s, by 1970. But they did do some science fiction stuff. And this one is Shadows from Beyond, which I think he only drew the cover for. He didn't do anything inside. But this is from like 1966. And there was a comic called Outer Space. This is Outer Space number 1 from 1968. So we're jumping ahead 10 years here. But since I happen to have all these here. So this has a Ditko story in it. And you can see his art style has changed. After doing superheroes, it's now become much more action-oriented. But again, these are comics that are not reprinted in the hardcover books that I just showed you. They're probably reprinted somewhere, but I don't know where. In fact, Craig Yo probably has reprinted them. We'll look at at the end of this video. We'll look at a hardcover Craig Yo book. And here is Space Adventures was revived. It had been a 1950s title. And this is from 1969. So this is issue number 5. And this has a Ditko story at the end. The spine on this one's kind of messed up. As you can see, here's an ad for them starting to do their ghost comics, which we'll look at later, much later in this video. And you can see in this one, they just reused the splash page for the cover, so they wouldn't have to pay extra. So more Ditko there. This is considered, I don't think he has any in this one. This is issue number 7. And then in the late 70s, Charlton revived both Space Adventures and Space War. Let's see if there's any Ditko in here. Again, it's a reprint of what we just saw just a little bit ago, the first one I showed you. So this is, if you can't afford, the Outer Space #1, and it looks like this reprints the issue. Put this away, and then Space War is here, and this was, you know, obviously because of the success of Star Wars, they decided to revive, you know, their science fiction titles. There's that one we just saw a little bit ago. And then they decided to reprint more of his 1950s stuff. So this is, you know, again, this was the kind of thing that back before those hardcover books came out from Fantagraphics, you were stuck with these reprints as your only way of getting reprints of this material. So I'm not going to show all these, but it was, you know, at the time when this came out in 1978, this was like, wow, 1950s Ditko. This is all, I think, 1950s Ditko in here. There's one, this one's story here has a very early looking Ditko to it. The writing, the lettering is odd. I wonder if he lettered it himself. And you can tell that that lighting is pretty fantastic. And this is one of the ones we saw in the hardcover book. So those are more of Space War. All right. So now we're going to go to the other big company that Ditko worked for in the 1950s, and that was Marvel Comics, then known as Atlas. Now, here's an example of the kind of thing Marvel was publishing at that same time in the early 1960s. They had a few anthology titles: Strange Tales, Journey into Mystery, Tales to Astonish, and Tales of Suspense. And then a fifth title called Amazing Adventures, which eventually became Amazing Adult Fantasy. Let's see, this is Strange Tales number 88 from September 1961. So around the same time as those Mysteries of Unexplored Worlds that we saw. In fact, probably around the same time as this one. So it would have been on the stands at the same time. And Ditko, I think he inked the cover of this one. It has sort of a Ditko-ish look on the cover. But Kirby, of course, drew the issue. I don't have many of these because they're kind of expensive. Let's see, did Ditko ink this one as well? Let's see if there's any credits on it. I don't see any credits. It has a sort of Ditko-ish look to it. And here's a Steve Ditko story. It's signed Ditko on there. The following year, and this one also has a little kid. Sometimes Ditko has these little kids, and they tend to have like big heads. But it's always very charming to see. You know, it's well suited for his more cartoony style. But you know, you can tell that it's like that. You know, people assume kind of that Stan Lee wrote all these stories. On the other hand, Stan Lee has usually said that whatever he only signed stories that he wrote. He would put his signature on them. He would put his signature on lots of stuff, even just like Patsy Walker pinup pages that L. Hartley drew. It would say Stan Lee on there as well. So maybe he did and maybe he didn't. That's a Don Heck story. But it's, you know, he would have been the editor at this issue, but don't know who actually wrote that story. So we'll move this aside here. Now, I did a previous video about Weird Wonder Tales. Actually, I did two videos. One was a couple years ago, and then I did one recently in 2022. So if you look under Weird Wonder Tales 2022, you'll be able to see more of me showing. In fact, I'll show it. Tales of Suspense number 37, which Ditko also drew like all but one of the stories in. This is a coverless Strange Tales number 83. It's somebody has written on there. So coverless copy, which I think I picked up for $1. Now this one has a story that was later reprinted. I have the reprint right here, in fact. I grab it. Later reprinted by Marvel, called Masquerade Party. And again, this just has a Ditko signature on it. It doesn't have a Stan Lee signature. So it's possible, he didn't write it. But in the 1970s, around the time Weird Wonder Tales was printed, this issue is actually from 1975. Marvel was reprinting a ton of their earlier work, the 1950s horror as well as the late 50s, early 60s fantasy monster stuff. And so this story was reprinted. So it gives you an idea of how faithful the reprints were to the originals, which is to say, not very. The coloring is all different. It's like the coloring, they probably didn't have a copy of the book to refer to, so even the character's hair color is different. So that's something to keep in mind if you buy one of these reprints. It's just there's no attempt to try to replicate the look of the original comic. You can see that panel in particular is very different. Just the coloring choices and everything are totally different. Let's see if we can get it in here. So it has a very different effect. But anyways, there's a character in here at the end. He sort of is like revealed as he's a masquerade, and he looks like a demon. He looks like the devil. On the other hand, he kind of looks like Mr. Dead, who was a Charlton character later as a ghost host. Now, it does kind of have a double twist ending here, where she says, "Take your mask off," and he says, "What mask?" Now, ordinarily, that would probably have been the end of the story, but there's a final little 2 panels here where it turns out, she's learned her lesson, and then it turns out that he actually did have a mask, which kind of, I guess is all right, but it makes you wonder if, like, the Comics Code prevented them from actually having a demon in the story. Here's another coverless one. Take it out of the bag here. I don't know what issue this one is offhand. It has a great Kirby splash, though. Save Me from the Weed. That would be later reprinted in either Curse of the Weird or Monster Menace. I don't know if this one actually has Ditko in it. Usually his stories would be at the back, so I'm going to guess that a very last story in here is drawn by Steve Ditko. There we go. This one story was also reprinted. I think it was reprinted in the back of a issue of Cole the Conqueror, because they would have, in the 70s, they would have like, sometimes they'd have like a 14-page story, and then there'd be like a little 5-page or less strip at the back. Now this one, you can see it says Stan Lee and Steve Ditko now. So it has both their names on it. It does kind of make you wonder how much Stan Lee actually did here, though, because this is very sparsely dialogued. Well, it starts to pick up afterwards. There's some more dialogue there.
Here's a little twist ending. It says, like this type of story, then don't miss amazing adult fantasy comics now on sale. The cool thing about these Ditko stories here during this time would he'd have these nice big splash pages that were, they look very simple, but they were very elegant looking. They were very attractive looking. They made you want to read the story. So he'd often have these big splashes for Marvel in his Marvel work. Now, of course, back in the day, you could either just have to get the originals of those stories, or you'd have to get 1970s reprints of the stories, or let's dig down here. In the there was some more here in 1970s, Where Creatures Roam and Where Monsters Dwell, and all those. This was the way that many people experienced Steve Ditko's pre-Spider-Man work for Marvel, was in these reprint comics. And this is, unless you were able to track down the originals. And then in the early 90s, around 93, Mort Todd had 2 miniseries. I'm actually missing number 4 of Curse of the Weird. And then there was 4 issues of Monster Menace, which reprinted some of these stories, and Ditko actually did some new work for them. So we're jumping ahead here to the early 90s. But that's a new Steve Ditko cover for this comic. And they heavily recolored them to match the modern styles of coloring. So they weren't trying to adhere to the original coloring in these things. If you saw my video on Weird Wonder Tales, you'll see this Basil Wolverton story was reprinted in Weird Wonder Tales #1. And there's a letters page type thing, and so another Ditko story reprinted. Now this was, again, a cheap way to get these stories, to get these early stories, if, back in the day, when there wasn't the options that we have now, which I'll show you in a moment. So I'm basically trying to give you a context of what it was like back in the day, wanting to read early Ditko. There's another Basil Wolverton story. And occasionally in here, there's little pinups that, new pinups that Ditko drew. This is a message from Stan Lee. There's I Spent Midnight with the Monster in Bald Mountain. Here's another new, a new Ditko pinup from the early 90s. More Kirby there. The Terror of Timbu Ba, which was reprinted in, I believe, reprinted in Weird Wonder Tales. There's a message from Stan Lee about these stories. And this is also a new Ditko cover showing the various monsters, and also says it has a note from Jack Kirby in here. So When the Totem Walks, again, that was we saw that in the Weird Wonder Tales video that I did. And Save Me from the Weed, again, we saw that just a little bit ago. Here's Jack Kirby's message about the creation of these stories. Here's the key to the cover, showing all the different characters, and this would be the writer and the artist talking about what story to do. So there's a lot of a lot of Ditko in here, a lot of Kirby, and so this is a cheap way to get access to some of these stories. You know, if you don't want to spend a lot of money on book collections, book comics like these sometimes show up in the dollar bins. And this is a new Ditko illustration this is from 1994. So he drew this in 1993. And we saw that story reprinted in that Where Creatures Roam. In fact, I'll bring that out again so we can just compare the different ways that they were done. So there's the Where Creatures Roam #3 reprint of the story. This was the sequel to the thing from Bald Mountain. And then here's the Monster Menace #3 reprint of it. Seems very similar. But, you know, the colors are a little brighter and stuff, or the paper is a little brighter. And there's that panel again. Let's see, in one of these, there's a, oh, here it is right here, a message from Steve Ditko. You know, because they had gotten messages from Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. So it says, we asked Steve Ditko to do the same. He offers the equivalent of 1,000 words below. And it's basically the editor saying, I asked Ditko if he'd like to comment on his early monster work. I'm expecting something soon. And it shows a bottle of ink being thrown through the door at the editor. So that's Ditko's statement on his early monster work. A bottle thrown through the door. Here's another new Ditko work from 1993. And it has the names, like there says Lee, Kirby, Marvel, Monster. So they're coming out of the typewriter and into the panels. And then the monsters jumping out of the pages. Now, of course, Kirby's version of the story is that you know, he wrote these stories, and Stan Lee or someone in the office, you know, wrote the words to the stories over his story. But that you know, it was really the artist himself who was coming up with these stories. You know, can I deliver the goods? I've created so many kinds of creatures, maybe there's nothing left, maybe. So it was up to the artist. And then, you know, but Stan Lee, being the editor, would of course have the final say on anything that appeared in the issues. And here's the final issue of Monster Menace. It has the totem, which we saw in, this is the sequel to the totem story. We saw the totem before in that Weird Wonder Tales video that I did. So if you want to compare how it looks. And this was a new drawing, and let's see. And then this Kirby story. So I don't think there's any more Ditko left in here. And that's it. So those are, you know, prior to our modern times, that was how you would get reprints of those old stories, those pre-Spider-Man, pre-Doctor Strange stories. Well, now, of course, this is what you're going to want instead. Things like this. This is the Marvel Masterworks hardcover volume collecting Tales of Suspense number 1 through 10. This is a hardcover book that came out in, let's see what year, 2006 it looks like. Corey Settlemeyer was the editor of the series. Now, they did make mistakes occasionally. You see how it says Tales to Astonish all through here. Well, this is incorrect. This is Tales of Suspense, not Tales to Astonish. So mistakes are sometimes made. And they do have art reconstruction on some of the work here because they didn't have original art available. Here's an introduction by Dr. Michael J. Vassilo. Tells us suspense number 1, and Ditko appears sporadically in here. Here we go, and tells us suspense number 1. The very last story is drawn by Ditko. It's hard to get it without that glare there. As you can see, his artwork is a little different this time. It's a little more detailed. He drew the cover of Tales of Suspense number 2. But eventually, he gets into that format that I talked about before, where he'll have a big splash page, a big open kind of page. There's some more Ditko in there. So yeah, if you buy these Masterworks volumes of all of these anthology titles, you know, you'll not only get Kirby and the other artists, but you will get Ditko as well, usually. You know, but it's not a sure thing. Usually, like I said, he would have his stories at the back. But this was kind of before they got into the format of having a Ditko 5-pager at the back of each issue. Now, if you're just interested in Ditko and you don't care about the others, or you just want a collection of Steve Ditko's Marvel work prior to Spider-Man, and you know, it's called pre-Marvel is what they call it. So basically his horror, science fiction, and fantasy monster stories from the 1950s up to like 1963. They released all of those, and Marvel did, in 2 big, thick hardcover volumes. And they're kind of oversized too. They're omnibuses. I only have volume 2, which somebody kindly sent me. There's Marvel Omnibus, which is a expensive book. This one says $100 retail price. So that's probably why I don't have volume 1 too. But they're a great book to have. If you have never, you know, bought any of these stories before and you just want them, and say you know that you like, you know, that they're worth the money to you, you might as well just skip all those reprints that I just showed you and just go for this. And this is, whoops, how it looks there. Move these out of the way. Pretty amazing package. And apparently very faithful to the original work. Now this book starts with Amazing Adult Fantasy number 7. Now the weird thing is that there is an Amazing Adult Fantasy omnibus if you just want all those issues, but they reprinted them in job order again, job number, production order. So some of the stories are kind of out of order of what they originally would have been in the magazine. And they kind of insert different stories from different comics. So this shows in the next issue of Amazing Fantasy. Then you jump ahead here to, this is Journey into Mystery number 74, it says up at the top. So this was one of his 5-pagers. This one's from Journey into Mystery number 75. And this is Tales to Astonish, and so on, until you get to the next issue of Amazing Adult Fantasy. So Amazing Adult Fantasy was an all Ditko comic. And there's Ditko's kids with the big heads again. And we're going to jump ahead, because this is a very thick. The only bad thing about this book is that it's very thick, but it's a beautiful book. I mean, it's worth $100. This is a great story, Quag. It's very typical, where this guy doesn't realize his hut is the monster. So we got this Amazing Adult Fantasy number 14. So this is the issue right before the first appearance of Spider-Man. And again, in my Weird Wonder Tales video that I did a month or two ago, they reprinted this story, Beware of the Giants. But this is its original appearance. It's a very stylish. We'll see this story reprinted later in this video when I show the Marvel Spotlight Dragon Lord issue. There was a reprint that reprinted this story at the back. Oh, and here's the letters page. That's another good thing about this. They reprint the original letters pages in these omnibus editions. It goes on and on. There's Hag, Hunter of Helpless Humans. They didn't reprint the cover of this one because Ditko didn't draw it. But again, you can see my original of this story in my Weird Wonder Tales video. I think, yeah, this is from Tales of Suspense number 39. This story was the backup story in the very first Iron Man comic. And now you can see that they're having credit boxes in these stories, just like the superhero stuff. It's a pretty cool cover. And so now we're getting to the end. Now the superheroes have already kind of taken over Marvel's comics, and so by this point, Journey into Mystery is already starring Thor, Tales of Suspense is already starring Iron Man, and so on. So this, Strange Tales already has Hulk in it. I mean, not Hulk, Human Torch. And Doctor Strange actually appeared a couple months before this, 2 issues before this. So this is getting very near the end of the of that era. So October 1963. By this point, Avengers and X-Men and stuff are debuting, and these little 5-pagers were phased out. So it was the end of an era, but the beginning of a new one, as Steve Ditko and Stan Lee will achieve their greatest fame with the superheroes to come.